next. Let's talk EU elections now here on the evening edition. The results are still coming in and being finalised. Gains, though, being made by the far right, the hard right and centre-right parties holding ground through most of the bloc. And as we mentioned earlier, it's caused France, Macron, to call a snap general election. But let's have a look at what all this means for the UK with Evie Aspinall, who's director of the think tank, the British Foreign Policy Group. Good evening to you, Evie.
Good evening. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for being on. So let's just take a summary so far of the European elections. And the big talking point, although largely the centre ground has still been held, the big talking point is the gains or are the gains made by hard right and far right parties. Tell me how you're interpreting that. Was that to be expected? Is that a common thing in most European countries, that they're leaning more towards the right?
Yes, so largely, actually, I think some people were even expecting the far right would do slightly better than they have, but not negating the fact they have done very well in these elections, particularly in a number of countries. So they've come first in 5 countries, second or third in another 5. So France, Germany, Austria, Italy, they've done very, very well. There are other countries such as Sweden where they have not done well at all and actually have done worse than in the past. But the broad trend across Europe is this move towards the far right, even as the centre-right still holds a quarter of the seats and so has the most influence within the EU still.
So terrible night for the Liberals and also the Greens as well. So this, I mean, if we were sort of, looking at younger Liberal voters and what they stand for and what some people might call woke politics, leaning into the Green agenda, leaning into the Liberal agenda, that's what's taken a beating here as well, which feels, broadly, considering this is a representative of all of the European Union, pretty harsh for those people who, genuinely want to do something about climate change.
Absolutely. And I think it really does reflect the fact that the Green parties did really well sort of 5 years ago. They were really riding the wave of things like Greta Thunberg, wider public awareness of climate change, and actually Russian invasion of Ukraine particularly has led to a real reconsideration across Europe of lots of climate policies just because of the cost of living crisis. That's what's really driven this kind of backlash. And it's also worth noting that the EU has gone very hard on green policies in the last 5 years. It's been a big part of its agenda. And actually now that's being equated with a lot of these wider challenges with this kind of perceived wokeness, which has caused this backlash, I think.
Do you think the Green vote was overinflated last time round? Could it have been kind of overpitched then, and this is a bit of adjusting, this is a bit of levelling up, or, is this just sadly a sign of the times?
I think to a degree. I think it definitely was the last time round overinflated. It was very much a kind of a moment and a time period, which is very hard to sustain long term. And also very hard for Green parties to work out their agenda outside of the environment. I think that's what a lot of Green parties struggle with. They can't work out a coherent policy beyond that on things like national security or justice, etc., which makes it quite challenging for them. And we have seen a return back to what I'd say was now below the status quo. I think we would expect the Greens to be doing better than this, and perhaps in the next election they might do better again.
So let's talk about how this affects the UK. How can we tally up what's happening in the EU elections, either with how that's going to affect us as the UK dealing with the EU, or whether actually we'll see some of those messages translated ourselves? We seem to be, heading away from the right when it comes to predicted polls or poll predictions, rather, for our general election on July the 4th.
We do, and it's actually quite interesting. We're kind of trending away from the US as well and our European allies. So it's quite an interesting kind of perspective that the UK currently has. I think the main implication for us is, I think it's a concern that actually you see that the EU will not only kind of move further right, the centre-right will win, but the far right will shift policies further right-wing. On a bilateral level, that might be okay for the UK because lots of those parties that have done quite well will want to kind of stick it to the EU and do some bilateral deals with the UK. Whether a potential new government, particularly if it's Labour, wants to strike deals with some of these people would be a different matter. But the really big challenge that I can see is that actually that it becomes more fragmented, it's less trusted on the international stage, and on issues that we do care about, so things like climate change and Ukraine, we won't be able to trust the EU in the way that we have in the last few years, even in the context of Brexit. And with the US also turning inwards, the UK will find itself increasingly isolated.
Yeah, and that's really important when it comes to Ukraine and financing military and aid packages as well, because if Macron lets the National Rally Party in, if they win at those parliamentary elections, and you've got a new prime minister there, he's going to find it harder to get his business done. He very much wants to present himself, Macron, as the sort of leader of Europe in terms of support for Zelensky. So it'll be interesting to see whether he has to pivot, whether he's forced to pivot from that, and and whether Zelensky loses allies within Europe because of that too, leaving the UK to have to bear the brunt. It's a sensitive topic in many countries, defence spending. Thank you so much for being with us. All super interesting. Evie Aspinall.